Okay, so let's continue with the Bronze Age, the so-called Bronze Age of comics. We usually note the year 1970 as the beginning of the Bronze Age, which is a very neat date. Once again, there is more of a transitional period, especially in the case of the representation of Black characters, as you are going to see very soon. But let's say it started with 70. One of the most important factors here is that in 71, a new editorial guidelines for the Comics Code, for the Comics Code Authority came into action, which allowed more freedom in what could be shown in comics, which meant that from the Bronze Age, more socially relevant problems were actually featured in comics. By socially relevant problems, I mean stuff like drug abuse and urban poverty and racial problems, especially racial problems. The Bronze Age is basically the rise of the Black superhero. But what really helped this rise of the Black superhero? This was actually a movie trend that helped the Black superheroes in comics. And I'm going to put a trailer in your group with this video so you can see what I mean when I talk about this trend, which is called Blaxploitation cinema. Blaxploitation cinema were basically low budget, low productional value action crime movies with Black protagonists sticking it up to the corrupt white man. They were exploitative movies. They were basically made to appeal to the oppressed Black communities. They were very violent. They were kind of ridiculous even by today's standards, but it was about Black men and women fighting against white supremacy. So of course they were appealing. Most of these Blaxploitation characters, they tended to have some criminal background. They were fast jive talking. They were rude and violent. Yeah, I'm going to show you a trailer about this, but the point is the rise of the Blaxploitation cinema in turn helped to promote the idea of the Black superhero. If you're more interested in how these two things were interrelated, I can recommend Nama Adilifu's book Super Black. If you're interested, I have it in PDF. I can show it in the group. So anyway, so many super important Black characters were created during this era. For example, Black Panther. Now, Black Panther was actually first introduced in 66 or 67. I have to check. 67, sorry, 67 in a Fantastic Four story. It was basically the Fantastic Four was lured into Wakanda, where they had to fight the different traps set by Black Panther and Black Panther himself. And at the end of the issue, it turned out that it was basically a test for Black Panther to see if he was ready to take on different enemies and ready to fight Killmonger. And even though at first he was kind of shown as an antagonist, an enemy, even before the actual issue came out and it was just the advertisement for the issue, Black Panther was pretty much painted as a villain. Then, of course, we know what happened with the character. I love Black Panther. Anyway, so yeah. So he was first published in the 60s, but only got his own series in the 70s. He was first featured in the so-called Jungle Action comics, which had pretty racist origins, from 73 till 76. written by Don McGregor. They were actually good stories. So even though the series itself, the title itself, had a racist past, McGregor was really good at writing this character and to be racially relevant and to discuss racial issues. And fun story, he was told that he didn't have enough white characters in the stories and that he should put more white characters into the Black Panther stories. And do you know what his response was? In the next issue, he actually had Black Panther beat up the Ku Klux Klan. He added white characters, he did. After it was cancelled, after Jungle Action was cancelled, Black Panther actually got his first self-titled series in 77, written by Jack Kirby. Kirby's stories were still pretty good, were still fun. He focused on sci-fi stories more and less on racial relations, but at least Black Panther had his own series. Other black characters that were introduced during this era are, for example, Falcon, Sam Wilson. He too was first published in the 60s, in 69, in a Captain America story. He was a bird enthusiast from Harlem who was lured into an island which was inhabited by villains and was run by basically the Red Skull. And basically, Captain America inspired him and mentored him into turning himself into a superhero, which is kind of problematic because you have a white guy telling the black guy what to do. Later on, when they left the island and Falcon became a co-star of the Captain America series, he became more racially relevant. He, for example, had a black girlfriend who was always telling him off for working together with the white guys. So yeah, he kind of became more and more emblematic. There are even analysis of the character, for example, of him being able to fly is actually a metaphor for social mobility for the blacks. So it's a really interesting character. Later on, the character himself was retconned, and it turned out that he used to work for the mob, that he was a criminal, and he was deliberately chosen and then mind washed by the Red Skull for Captain America to take on a mentee with a criminal past. We like to forget it today. We like to forget that he used to be a criminal. Luke Cage was also a character, a black character that was introduced during this era in 72. He was a guy imprisoned by crimes he didn't commit, and then he was experimented on prison, which gave him powers, and then he broke out and became a hero for hire. He was originally named Lucas something, I can't remember, and then he chose the name Luke Cage to represent his past. Once again, these elements from his storylines are pretty much metaphors for what was happening to the black community in the 70s. So imprisonment, criminal past, being framed for a crime, being experimented on. So yeah, once again, comics during this era started to become more and more socially relevant. Beyond black narratives, drug abuse became also a very popular issue that was dealt with in comic books, especially since the US saw a crack epidemic, so-called crack epidemic, in the early 80s. And one story that kind of talked about that was Cloak and Dagger. The two characters were introduced in a Spider-Man story in 84, so we are kind of moving towards the so-called modern age of comics, but it's still kind of the Bronze Age. Dagger was a white girl from an upper middle class family, neglected by her mother, so she ran away. White Cloak was a working class black boy whose best friend was killed by a policeman, and then he too ran away. The two they were teenagers. The two of them met in New York City. They became friends and then lovers later on, and they were recruited to basically to try out a new drug in the comics, and this drug caused them to develop superpowers, while many of the other kids that took part in the experiment died. And then they basically made a promise to each other to hunt down those people who were responsible for what happened to them and to their friends. This story was also very metaphorical about how the crack epidemic is colorblind. It can touch anybody. So once again, upper class white girl, working class black boy. The two characters were reintroduced in 2011 in the Ultimate Universe, so they had a new origin story in that publication, which was pretty much actualized to modern audiences, and they also had their own live action series that ran for 2 seasons. It's a pretty good story, by the way, especially the first season. It's not for everyone. It's kind of artistic and philosophical, but if you are into that thing, I can totally recommend the series. For example, there is an episode in the first season that is completely taking place in a character's mind who is going crazy and keeps reliving the same half an hour or something like that. So it's kind of strange, but it's very interesting. It's set in New Orleans, so the creators worked in a fair amount of voodoo and local religions. So it's super interesting, by the way. And basically, this is most that I wanted to tell you about the Bronze Age of comics. Just a little bit about the business part. By this time, we mostly have single issue stories. So still one storyline is one issue, but there is more continuity by this time, and one issue usually contains one story, one round story, not like anthology issues. Comics are becoming more expensive. Collector culture is starting to bloom by the 70s. We know that comic book stores are coming up. So the whole industry is becoming more subculture, but more expensively made. But this is something that we have already talked about. The early 80s also see this bigger company-wide events, crossover events, for example, like the Crisis on Infinite Earths in 84, where DC basically rebooted their whole line. They restarted the whole universe with new origin stories, or the Dark Phoenix saga, which saw the bonding of Jean Grey with the Phoenix Force and her eventual descent into madness and villainy, which is still one of the most well-known X-Men stories, and still one of the most sexist and controversial X-Men stories. So yeah, that's about the Bronze Age, and I'll be back with the modern age of comics.